And we are very glad to welcome all of you, the journalists and the photographers here in the room. I know a lot of you have probably been up late last night. I know that goes for Rune as well. But we are very glad this morning to again welcome Rune Stubager from the University of Aarhus, who's one of the most prominent Danish election experts and analysts. And we have agreed with Rune this morning that he'll kick off here by giving a presentation of the key conclusions, if there are any. I'm very excited to hear on the results that came in last night.
I have planned to say something about 4 topics in my initial presentation. Now, first I'll talk briefly about the campaign to just set the context. Then a few words on the sort of overall result of the election last night. And then I'll go into a couple of the individual parties and talk a little bit about what might explain their results. And then I'll end by saying just a few words about the North Atlantic seats or members of parliament that were elected last night. So the campaign that we've seen over the past 3-4 weeks, I think, was fought over 3 main issues. The Social Democrats were successful in the beginning of the campaign by setting the agenda and focusing it on social inequality. They launched a proposal to introduce a wealth tax, which we don't have currently in Denmark. They also introduced a proposal to reform the pension system so that people who've been on the labour market for a long time, often in hard physical jobs, would be able to retire earlier than other people. Then they also launched proposals on immigration. So that's an important. The second item of the campaign, or the second issue of the campaign, was immigration, where the Social Democrats also launched a proposal containing 18 specific proposals for tightening regulations in various ways. None of them were all that new or radical, perhaps with the exception of one that we might talk about. But then, of course, also the Danish People's Party launched their proposal with their main request being that there should be a net migration of Muslims out of Denmark over the coming year. That would be their, or the coming period, that would be, is their sort of ultimate demand in order to support a new government. But then there was a third, to most people, I guess, unexpected topic, at least looking at the situation before the campaign, and that was a classic topic of pollution. In the form of pollution of the drinking water, where we have in various parts of the country beginning to see problems with residue of pesticides seeping into the drinking water, also nitrate coming from fertilizers used by the agricultural sector. And a side issue, you could say, to this was animal welfare, particularly in the pig production. Denmark is one of the largest pig producing countries in the world. We have the highest per capita number of pigs of any country in the world. So this is very intensive, and I think it's fair to say that it has some implications for animal welfare in the stables. This is not a new thing. It's been like that forever, well, at least for decades, that this very intensive farming industry has these implications for the drinking water, but also for animal welfare. But this time it broke through and took national attention on the agenda. So that was the third issue. I've been talking to a number of your colleagues during the campaign, and many of them have started out by asking me, so what about Greenland and what about foreign policy? And I think I have to disappoint, at least it seems that I disappointed them to some extent, because these issues have not been part of the campaign. We've not discussed the position of Greenland or the relationship with Greenland. We've not discussed Danish foreign policy as part of the campaign. Basically because most of the parties are in pretty much agreement on these issues. And that also means, I should say, skipping a little bit ahead, that I don't foresee any change of the Danish position on Greenland nor foreign policy almost no matter which which government gets formed eventually. So, but that was it for the overall the campaign. Then just an overview of the result, which is, I guess, as Peter hinted, and I am sure you've noticed yourselves, pretty difficult to give, in the sense that the result yesterday was rather muddy and resulted in a fragmented parliament, where it's difficult to see exactly which government will be formed. So we're looking into rather prolonged negotiations, at least by Danish standards. I know compared to some other countries we're still pretty quick, but I'm expecting weeks at least, because the parties have made various announcements before the election and during the campaign also, and in that sense put up a number of tripwires for themselves. And as far as I can see it, it's not possible to form a government if all these tripwires are intact. So somebody will have to go back on a promise in order for there to be a government. The current government will resign later today. There's no longer a majority behind it, and it is to be expected that if they wouldn't resign on their own, then they would be brought down by a majority in parliament. So that will take place today. Also because the Liberal Party Venstre has said that they no longer want to be part of the government. So the current government will resign, and then later today in the afternoon, from all the parties elected to parliament will go to the palace to advise the king on who should be given the task of forming a new government. And there's a whole game already going on about exactly what will they say and which parties should be for part of the government that they would like, and whom would they want to point to as the well, first it will probably be what is usually called an informateur, so somebody who will be tasked with finding out the possibilities of forming a new government, and not directly given the task of forming a new government. But we'll see, it depends on what they will say, and again there it also looks pretty open, and it may be so that the party that gets the most votes, in the sense that most parties will point to it, might be a party from the right bloc, even though the left bloc is the largest bloc, because the far left Red-Green Alliance have said that they will not point to Mette Frederiksen as the leader of these negotiations, except if she promises not to go for a centre government, which I'm sure she's not going to promise. So we'll see. This game is on and will continue in the days to come. So it's really not possible to say what type of government we will get. If you, and I'm sure you will at some point, ask me to speculate, I still think it's most likely that Mette Frederiksen will continue as Prime Minister. Whether it will be in a new centrist coalition or a government based mostly on votes from the Red Bloc, that is up to the negotiations. I think the tripwires are so thick, if you will, on the right side. Particularly the Danish People's Party has said that they will never, under any circumstances, support a government that has Lars Løkke Rasmussen, the leader of the Moderate Party, as a minister. And they have made that, I think, promise, or whatever you want to call it, so clearly and so repeatedly during the campaign that it will be very dangerous for them to go back on that promise. The same types of wires on the left side are not, I think, as thick or solid, but we will see. It's also up to, and that I guess gives me the opportunity to say, to talk a little bit about that, the Moderate Party, because they are the kingmaker party between the two blocs. And if we are to discuss who won the election last night, I'd say there's only one winner, and that's one real winner, and that's the Moderate Party. Because even though they lost a few seats, they are in the position that they really thrive in as the kingmaker party. So none of the two blocs are able to form a majority without them. And so it's really up to them and what they want to support as to what government we'll get. And they have said that their priority is a center government again. And the Social Democrats are open to it. There's also other parties that are open to it, but we'll see. It takes 90 seats to form a majority in the parliament, and they are, I think, maybe short of some. So we'll see. Yes, I think that was what I wanted to say about the sort of overall result. Then going into some of the individual parties, it's very clear that all three governing parties lost, but some lost substantially more than others. And to start out with the largest loss, that's of course for the Social Democrats. They got the worst election since 1903, so that's a long time. They're trying to sort of spin it to say that, well, we're still the largest party, and surely if they retain the position as Prime Minister, then they will say, well, yeah, okay, we prevailed still. But it is a large loss for them. They're also saying that, well, this is due to the cost of ruling. We see that across many countries that governments tend to lose, and that's also correct. I think, though, that this particular loss for them in this election was larger than you could explain just by the cost of ruling. And also, by the way, they managed to gain votes in the 2022 election, where they were also in government. So it's not a very convincing explanation, I would say. To me, the main explanation for their loss is that they disappointed a lot of their voters from 2022 by not necessarily by entering the current or resigning government, but through the policies that were enacted as part of that government. Actually, a very sort of basic and simple thing that the government came in 2022 and as one of their first initiatives scrapped a national holiday. And this idea to scrap this holiday hadn't been discussed in the campaign, and many of their voters are simply haven't really understood nor forgiven that move yet, or still. So, and there's also been discussions in the campaign of whether to reintroduce this holiday. We'll see. The argument back then was that we need to scrap this holiday in order to work more so that we could, there would be more money for the public budget to fund rearming the Danish military. But the problem for that explanation has been that over the years since then, whenever the Ministry of Finance have done their audits of so what do the funds look like in the future, they've been able to find more future money. And they've done so, well, basically every 6 months or so. So the argument that we needed to work more in order to get more money to fund the military has been completely undercut. So that, of course, hasn't helped them either. Also, they've, as part of the government, been party to lowering taxes for higher incomes. So in basically, they've moved to the right on the economy compared to what their voters would like. I should say, though, that the loss, I don't see their loss as a reaction to their line on immigration. Certainly not to them moving to the right, which they did already 2 elections ago on immigration. It's not so that their voters were disappointed that they were too right-wing on immigration. If anything, to the contrary, because I'm pretty sure that when we get the election, the final results, so that we can see how voters moved between the parties, I'm pretty sure that they will also have lost some voters to the Danish People's Party. Partly on immigration, but partly also due to discussions about the cost of living, where the Danish People's Party have been very keen on that agenda, and just yesterday gave out, well, not free, but discounted petrol at several petrol stations across the country to sort of highlight the issue of the rising cost of living. So that was for the Social Democrats. The other party in the government, the Liberal Party, are in basically the same situation. They also lost. They just barely retained the position as the largest party in the Blue Bloc, but not by much. And they have gotten the worst election result ever that party has recorded. So that's also quite a perspective. I think for them it's a similar situation as for the Social Democrats, in that they had promised in the 2022 election to never make Mette Frederiksen Prime Minister. They instead were courting the idea of potentially impeaching her over a scandal in the previous government. But then, as you know, they turned around and supported her as Prime Minister in the government. And many right-wing voters simply felt that that was unacceptable. And I think they're paying the price for that now, even though they have been able to pass, as I said, fairly right-wing policies on the economy. But apparently the voters were not satisfied with that. Yes, so moving on to the third party in the coalition, the current coalition, the moderates. As I said, they've suffered a small loss of seats, but not very much, and certainly not very much compared to where they were in the polls just 3-4 months ago. I heard Lars Løkke Rasmussen, the party chairman, the foreign minister, last night in his speech saying that, back in December, mid-December, they had a poll that put them at 1.5% of the vote, which of course is under the 2% threshold. And now they were back at, 7-point-some% or something. So actually a gigantic turnaround for them. I would find two explanations for this turnaround. One being Donald Trump and the stage, if you will, that he put up around the issue of Greenland, a stage on which Lars Løkke Rasmussen, as the foreign minister, was able to perform and show some of the skills that he has, as he is, as of today, the one member of parliament that has the longest record as a member of parliament. And of course he's a former prime minister and also foreign minister. So, and he's skillful, a skillful politician, and he was able to show that to the voters in these discussions over Greenland. At least that's the perception that we get. I wasn't, and not many people were in these rooms with the American foreign minister and vice president, but it seemed that what came out of it was a solution that might work for Denmark. And just yesterday there were stories coming out from the American side of the negotiations moving toward the US maybe getting 3 extra bases in Greenland, which they could already have had under the agreement that was already in place and has been in place since 1951. So if that is the outcome, then I think Denmark and Greenland will be very satisfied. And the foreign minister was at least party to steering this discussion onto this diplomatic track. And many voters like that. His party got a nice boost in the polls, as did the Prime Minister's party, by the way, right after, in the beginning of February, right after these discussions. But then the second factor is just Lars Løkke Rasmussen himself, in the sense that he's a very skilled campaigner, and the campaign left him as pretty much the only person who was able to argue or to assume this role as the voice of reason, arguing for parties to come together and form this agreement across the center, and in that sense appealing to unity. This appeal to unity and the idea of a broad agreement and parties working together has quite some appeal to Danish voters. They generally like this idea. Then of course the question is what policies may come out of it, and then they may not like it after all, as we've seen with the government. But this idea has some appeal. So him, given his personal qualities that he showed on the international scene, and also his capacity as a campaigner, and then combined with this position as the one party standing for this centrist cooperation, at least most clearly, I think was what got them the result that they got, which they undoubtedly will consider a great victory, even though they lost some votes. The final party I'll just briefly talk about is the Danish People's Party. because you could say that they're back again in the sense that they experienced almost near annihilation in the 2022 election, where they got just 2.5% of the votes after a tumultuous time internally in the party, change of party leadership, a split of many of their experienced MPs to primarily the Denmark Democrats. So now they're back and they deservedly is what I was looking for, celebrated that last night. If you look at it in a wider perspective, though, you shouldn't interpret this as a sign that Danish voters have moved to the right on these issues, because over the years since, well, for the past 2.5 decades or so, these immigration skeptic parties have polled in the area somewhere between 13 and 16, 17%. And if you combine the Danish People's Party with the Denmark Democrats and the Citizens Party, all three clearly immigration skeptic parties, then we're at about the same level. So a large part of the Danish People's Party success comes from a fourth right-wing immigration skeptic party, the New Right, that got a nice election in 2022, but since then have completely collapsed and couldn't run this time. So they just took over a lot of their votes. So in total, the support for these more immigration skeptic parties is pretty much at the level that it's been for the past couple of decades overall. So that's an important part of the story for how to understand also the success of the Danish People's Party. Okay, moving on to the fourth point, the members of parliament elected in the North Atlantic. As you may know, we have 2 members of parliament elected in the Faroe Islands and 2 members elected in Greenland. And their votes count for just as much as the 175 members of parliament elected in Denmark. So from the Faroe Islands, it's status quo in the sense that it's the two incumbents are re-elected. So one from the Social Democratic Party, who's expected to support also a left-wing government, and one from a party that collaborates with the Danish Liberal Party, supposed to support a right-wing government. For Greenland, it's in a sense also status quo. Both of the 2 incumbent members from Greenland didn't run, but one of them from the left-wing party IA, they were able to secure election of their new candidate. But then the second member, which was initially elected for their Social Democratic Party, Siumut, but in the period she had left that party and joined the Greenlandic Independence Party, Nalarak. And in that sense, you could say it's also status quo, because the second member from Greenland was exactly from Nalarak, and in fact turned out to be the brother of the one who just resigned. Greenland is a small country, so that's not that unusual. But I think this latter bit, the election of a member from Nalarak, is potentially the one thing that has that could have some international implications, in the sense that this party is the strongest proponent and supporter of Greenlandic independence and a quick move towards Greenlandic independence. And some of their members, at least, are also open to collaborating more with the US, not as part of joining the US, but they are open to working with the US, it seems, to get basically an alternative to Denmark. So, I mean, it will not have any implication for the line of the Danish government. It will remain the same, but they now have a platform in the Danish parliament that they can use to work for their position. And it will be interesting to see to what extent that will create maybe a less clear line and make an opening for the Americans to say, well, there are voices in Greenland that don't want to be part of Denmark anymore, and we're just working with them. So that will be interesting to see. that was what I had to say now.
To you, Rune, about the researched Danish People's Party on two aspects. One, Morten Messerschmidt yesterday very early indicated he's not interested in any participation in a government now. He looks forward, he wants to be in opposition. So what do you think about his long-term perspectives, one? And secondly, it was in the campaign, he was talking about when it comes to Greenland, he wants to abolish the self-government law, which is quite a radical step, which could also increase the tensions. So what's his comment on that? Thank you.
In last, yes, I mean, that is a very provocative stance to many people in Greenland. But I don't think it will go anywhere because the other parties are not going to support that. I think that the specific part of the self-government rule is that he wants to introduce a requirement that if Greenland were to move for independence, then there would also have to be a referendum in Denmark and not just in Greenland to support Greenlandic referendum or independence. And I don't see the other parties supporting that, and I don't see them giving him any sort of concessions on that. So that was the second question. The first, well, it is clear that he is sort of trying to build up for a longer run to reconquer the position as the sort of dominant right-wing immigration skeptic party that the Danish People's Party had for many years, and that has been challenged for the past 2-3 elections. And I think it's a good step towards that. I'm not so sure that they will be able to get rid of their main competitor, the Denmark Democrats, because they're very strongly positioned to appeal to rural voters. And also their chairman, Inger Støjberg, is just also a strong politician in her own right. So I think as long as she's in charge of that party, that was also, by the way, the party that many of the Danish People's Party MPs left for in the run-up to 2022. So I think it will be difficult for them to get rid of that competitor, even though they lost seats yesterday. It's more unclear what will happen with the new Citizens Party that just managed to clear the 2% threshold. Basically only their chairman is known. He was an MP elected for this new right party that imploded in the last season. So, but it remains to be seen who else is elected from that party, and they are bound to be new and inexperienced, and also it's a system-critical party, if you will. He said yesterday, well, I don't play by the same rules as all these other politicians. I don't owe anything to anybody, was what he said. And he's not saying who he wants to point to or what he wants to do. There's a certain likelihood that the party may splinter simply because I think some of these people have, well, very large egos, and it may be difficult for them to cooperate. So I don't see them as a too serious competitor for the Danish People's Party in the long run.
Just gets its mandate from case to case. And the second question is, how do you assess the position of Mette Frederiksen among the public? Is she popular or is she unpopular?
To take the last question first, that's a good one. She's obviously lost popularity, and I think she's probably more popular in certain foreign capitals than among Danish voters. Certainly voters on the right, there's a lot that simply just want to get rid of her by now, and really there's a lot of resentment also going back to the pandemic, where of course she was the face of restrictions and lockdowns and all that. And then this time around she also was unpopular with a lot of voters on the left who thought that she'd gone too far to the right. And they really want her to sort of quote-unquote come home or come back to the red bloc. So in that sense, they are of course wanting her to do, well, maybe not as you suggest, form a minority government, but then form some form of left-wing coalition. But the moderates say they don't want to be part of a government that is based on the votes of the Alternative or the Red-Green Alliance. And that would make such a combination impossible. So yes, in theory, a social democratic minority government could be formed, but that would depend on the moderates. And if they say that no, we don't want to tolerate such a government, then it can't be formed. As you may know, we have this system of negative parliamentarism in Denmark, meaning that a government, there's no vote of investiture. It's not so that there has to be a vote in parliament for a new government to take office. But if there is an expectation that if a government would immediately face a vote of no confidence in parliament, then it cannot be formed. So it's all now about what the parties are saying, also both publicly, but also when they go to the king later today, because that's what it hangs on. So if, for instance, if the moderates don't say that they would topple such a government, then it would be possible for it to form. But I am pretty sure that they will say something that would prevent that, at least for now. And I don't see that. Why would they not want to be part of such a government themselves? I mean, Lars Løkke Rasmussen thrives in his current job. He would probably, in his own mind, thrive in it even more as Prime Minister. And I think that's certainly on the agenda, that he will try to take that role. So that's also part of the game. He has proposed himself as what the literal translation from Danish is the royal investigator, kongelig undersøger, which is sort of the informateur role. Say, I'm not a candidate as Prime Minister, but I would want to lead the negotiations to form a new centrist government. But of course, having that leading role gives you certain privileges in such a process. So I think there's not many people who believe his assurance that he does not want to be Prime Minister. And of course now he's the kingmaker, so I think he will try to play it as hard as he can.
Said that the foreign policy would continue the way it has, but do you see any implications now for the foreign or the European politics from this? Because Mette Frederiksen has been a very prominent figure in the politics. And my second question would be that if you put the election in the European political landscape, how does the results if you think about the European political trends of protest and yes, how do they fit to that? Thank you.
Yeah, so of course, I mean, I think Mette Frederiksen is one of the, if not the longest sitting Prime Minister or President in the EU. So she's been in that game for longer than most other people in that group. And in that sense, and also given her position, she's to some extent on top of that game, to the extent that you could be that. And that, of course, is also part of, that was used clearly during the Greenland crisis, if you will, to mobilize European support for Denmark and Greenland. And so if she is not the Prime Minister in a couple of months, then in that sense, that may put Denmark a little bit behind in these negotiations. On the other hand, if it's Lars Løkke Rasmussen who takes over, I think he will pretty quickly slip into that role. He's been there before also. So that I don't think would change very much, and they stand for basically the same line, I would say, in EU matters. Certainly also on the Ukraine. The only party that's, well, there's two parties that, well, the only party that has been really sort of critical to some extent of Danish support at the current level for the Ukraine is the Danish People's Party, who are saying we should now, instead of just giving it as donations, we should give it as loans. But that's not been discussed in the campaign, and I don't think the other parties are going to give in on that either. So I don't really see much change in that sense. Then putting the election in sort of the wider European perspective, that's a difficult question. On the one hand, yes, this was a protest election in the sense that the government coalition lost a lot of seats. But I think it was protest over the policies that they enacted as part of that government, and I think also, at least to me, an understandable protest in the sense that people who voted for the Social Democrats in 2022 didn't expect to have to be without a holiday, didn't expect to see taxes lowered for high incomes. On the other hand, people who voted for the Liberal Party didn't expect them to support Mette Frederiksen as Prime Minister. So I think in that sense, I mean, to some extent that's what democracy is about. You get rid of the rascals if you think they are such. I mean, so if you get disappointed, then you vote for somebody else. And I think that's what we've seen at one level. Then, of course, there's also an element of fragmentation, which I guess you also see depending a lot, of course, on the electoral systems, because the Danish system is open to fragmentation because we have this 2% threshold. So that, at least on that count, matches, I guess, what you see in the Netherlands, where, as I understand it, there's basically no threshold. So in that sense, it adds up. So far, I should say, I mean, we still also in the outgoing election had 12 parties. So in that sense, there's no more parties in parliament than there was just before. But the votes are spread out somewhat more. The Social Democrats in particular are clearly not as big as they were, so there's more fragmentation. So far, at least for the period that's coming to an end now, it hasn't really, at least as far as I can see it, implicated the sort of capacity of Parliament to function and to pass laws. Partly, of course, because we had a majority government. So when they had agreed internally, then they could push it through Parliament if they wanted to. But in reality, the vast majority of legislation in Denmark is passed by broader majorities than just the bare necessity. And most often involving parties from two of the traditional blocs. And it's a very large proportion that's even passed unanimously in Parliament. So yeah, so I don't think it would entail that we will be unable to govern or something like that. But of course, there's also the final thing. This Citizens Party is a clear protest party. But okay, they got 2.1% of the vote, so the protest isn't that large after all in that sense. I think the main thing that may keep Danish voters from voting more for these protest or otherwise system critical parties, particularly on the right, is that the Danish mainstream parties have a tough line on immigration. And that means that you don't have to vote for these more system critical parties in order to get these policies, like you have to potentially in Germany, for instance.
I'd like to hear about the pension system, which was one of the agenda, and I think what the Social Democrats proposed is to kind of slow down the pace of the planned increase of retirement age over 70. And how do you see the kind of a public opinion during this campaign? And based on the result of this election, what would you expect to?
That also, I guess, is what many voters would consider surprising if they were to be able to move yet. I mean, just by way of background, the current system is governed by an agreement reached, I think, in 2006 by a majority in Parliament that pension age should rise with the life expectancy, so that we would sort of on average have the same number of years in retirement in expectation as life expectancy progresses, which of course is economically a very clever move in the sense that it means that people will then work longer and instead of being retired longer, and that solves the potential financial problems related to that in the future. But of course, I mean, it entails that as you could project life expectancy just continuing to rise, people would have to work well into their 70s. And particularly people working in hard physical jobs have all along said, well, this just is not possible. How would I be able to work into my 70s? Then there are, of course, various schemes set up for people who are too ill to work, but you have to go through a doctor to be eligible for these. And what the critics of the current system want is for people to be able to decide on their own if they want to retire at a certain age. And so the Social Democrats are saying that, well, they will now only, well, and this has to, the system is such that Parliament has to vote every 5 years on increasing the pension age if life expectancy has increased in the previous 5 years. And then there was a vote on this just last year, and the Social Democrats said this is the last time we will vote for this just automatically. Now we want to discuss the details of it. And the details, well, and then, as you say, their proposal is to slow this increase so that it, rather than increasing by a full year, then they only increase by half a year pension age. But then also introduce a more generous system for people who've been in the labour market for many years to retire earlier if they themselves want to. This is pretty popular in the population. People like this idea of being able to retire earlier, that they can decide it themselves, and they also struggle to see, at least for many people, how they could work into their 70s. But of course, then that reopens the financial question of how to finance this in the future, and that's pretty open. And that's why I cannot really answer your second question. What will happen now? I think some of it will happen because the other parties are also sensing there's something we may need to address here. Certainly parties on the left want this to change, but parties on the right say, yeah, okay, but where should the money come from?
Will act as a kingmaker. Will he want it to be his government in a sense? And on Greenland, I take your point that it wasn't in the campaign, but when you look at the way the polls were, as you mentioned in December, was the White House visit in a way the defining moment?
To some extent, yes. I mean, as I said, Donald Trump put up a stage on which Lars Løkke could perform, and he performed well in the eyes of most Danes. So at least it gave them a boost. They still got a better election last night than they were in for at the beginning of the campaign. So combined with this, role as the voice of reason in the center, that gave them the election result that they got last night. And yes, I think if you were able to really get his inner thoughts out of him, which I don't think you would be, but then I think Lars Løkke Rasmussen would want to be Prime Minister again. And I think he will go to quite some length to try to sort of negotiate. He said during the campaign that it would be healthy for the Social Democrats to try for the first time to be part of a coalition without being the party of the Prime Minister. And then who else would be in such a coalition? Now the Liberals are saying they don't want to be part of a coalition with the Social Democrats. Then, well, who's left in the room then? And as I said, I mean, him having this role, no majority, at least sort of the way we would usually understand it, can be formed without his party, then I'm sure he will try to get the best of it. We've had only, I think in Danish political history, we've only once had a government where the Prime Minister was not from the largest party in the coalition, and that was from 1968 to 71. conservative, liberal and social liberal government, where the social liberals were the smaller party but still got the position as prime minister. So it has happened before, but not with the social democrats. And it would be really a hard blow for them if
in this crisis. How successful do you think was this movement, given that she lost the votes?
Well, looking at the numbers, you'd say that was unsuccessful. But if you go back to her polling in early January, it was successful in the sense that she was able to retain the boost that she got in the polls in early February after these Greenland discussions. So in that sense, she was able to capitalize on the gains she made on that, but she wasn't able to sort of get an even higher support out of it. I think it is correct to say that she called it because the situation in the polls, but also, I mean, the election had to come no later than late October. So the rest of the year would have been discussions about when would the election be called eventually. So it would be politically not very productive anyway. And I think her fear was that as maybe the agenda shifted back to domestic issues, then that boost that she and her party got would wither away in the polls, and then they may be driven down to the position that they had in early, or the support they had in early January, which would be disastrous. Mm-hmm. Now it's just very bad. Early January was disastrous. Not in the election, but it's very important, of course, to people. I mean, it made a very huge impact on the public, and certainly led many people to reconsider their perception of the US as our ally. And the Prime Minister reflected this in the campaign, saying that, well, the US probably still is our most important ally, but she no longer considers the US our closest ally. And I think that captures the sentiment of the population very well. So in that sense, yes, it's very important, but it was just not an issue in the campaign because there's very little disagreement among the parties on this issue.
Is there any chance that Frederiksen could step down after this poor election? And second off, could you maybe elaborate why you think the Danish People Party or the far right wing was popular despite Mette Frederiksen's tough stance on immigration? Was it economic grievance? If you could elaborate on that.
Mm-hmm. I don't think she will step down. She didn't make any hints in that direction at all last night in her speech, which is why I had to stay up late, because she only gave that speech very late. So no, I don't think so. And they are certainly playing all the, I mean, they are also, I mean, Lars Løkke is a tough player, but they will also be tough players in the game that's going on now. So they are, of course, playing for first prize in the sense of retaining the position as Prime Minister. And I think they have a decent chance, as I said. So we will not see, I mean, it would be only if they were not to gain that position, then she may start talking about it. I don't think she would remain in Parliament as leader of the opposition or whatever for all that long. But as long as there's a chance of continuing as Prime Minister, she will remain on. I think for the support for the immigration skeptic parties, as I said, has been fairly stable at this level, 13-17% of the vote, except for 2015, where the Danish People's Party got 21%. I think that was not mainly due to immigration, but also criticism of too much centralization, and also Lars Løkke running as a very unpopular candidate for the Liberals at that election. I think that in Denmark, and I think that goes for most other Western European countries, there is a certain segment of the population that simply does not like multiculturalism, does not like immigration, is very, very critical of the role of Islam and the presence of visible, particularly religious minorities, and the demands they make on majority society. And I think they are not sort of going to go away, and they will always ask for more, and they will get more from these parties. So in the sense of even stricter policies. So to me, the question is whether other parties that are on other accounts maybe inclined to vote for more mainstream parties, whether they will think that the mainstream parties are addressing particularly the immigration issue to an extent that they sort of feel comfortable with or feel is sufficient for them to not then move to these parties. So I think it's not a matter of being able to, as mainstream parties, suppress or completely undercut these parties, but you will prevent them from rising beyond this segment. At least that's my interpretation of it. I don't think a new election would be really, we haven't seen that before, let me put it that way. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, we had what I call real snap elections, and I mean, there was elections for every 2 years in the 70s, and there's elections in both 87 and 88. So it's not that couldn't happen. I think it would be more likely that we would see some government being formed, but then maybe it would break down shortly afterwards. Although I mean, they will probably negotiate something that they will then try to stick to. So I'm not really for this. I mean, we don't need a majority. I mean, we have a long, I guess, proud tradition in Denmark of minority governments. So that's sort of the standard that we would have. I mean, in that sense, the now outgoing government is the exception. But if we are to have a new centrist government, then it needs a majority, because otherwise the parties on either side of it will bring it down. I mean, as I said, with the tripwires that they've put up for themselves, it's difficult to see, particularly with the Liberals saying that they don't want to be part of a coalition. Because otherwise you could have just added the Social Liberals and the Conservatives to the current coalition, and then I think they would have a majority again. But if the Liberals don't want to be part of it, at least not for now, and then that seems off the table. But I mean, if the moderates were to join one side, then we could have nice stable governments.
You mentioned that foreign policy didn't play a pivotal role in the campaign of the election. Does that mean that most Danish people or voters, they don't care so much about the foreign policy? Second is, you mentioned that there's very few disagreements in Greenland issue among different parties. So about other foreign policies, like the support to Ukraine and the status in Middle East, and also the relation with the EU, does different parties have different attitudes, or do they have some very contradict attitude?
Well, it's not that Danes don't care about foreign policy. I mean, people care deeply about certainly the security issue, and also there's a lot of, I think, emotions involved in the issue of Greenland. But the parties, as I said, tend to agree, and therefore there's nothing much to discuss in the campaign. I mean, we will get pretty much the same policy no matter what party we vote for, and therefore it didn't play a role in the campaign. But of course there is disagreement on various also foreign policy issues in the population. We used to have a large Eurosceptic segment of the population. We still do to some extent, but the parties have moved on that, and so the parties are now, we used to have many fairly Eurosceptic parties, we don't have that anymore. The Danish People's Party have said that, well, they don't foresee Denmark leaving the EU in the immediate future, even though they would want that in the long run. But so they actually gave in a little bit on that during the campaign. I mean, as I said, they've also been the more critical party with respect to supporting the Ukraine to the same extent by the way of donations. And there's some movement on that because it's expensive, of course. And of course there's also disagreement to some extent over how much support Denmark should give to by way of aid to developing countries. That's also been discussed in the campaign, not that much, but right-wing parties want to cut, left-wing parties want status quo. So yes, there is disagreement, but it's not that important in a campaign. That it's well, certainly not this one.